Welcome back to Unleashed, guys. We are honored that you are tuning in to us today, and remember that we are the resistance. We, you, me, all of us, standing up for what we know to be true, and today is going to be a big piece of that. I mean, I'm telling you, today is going to move your heart. If you love adventure, if you love, if you love your wife, you love your kids, you love your country, today is going to be right down your alley. So, Eric, good to see you.
Hello.
This is Monday. What's today's date?
Today is the 24th.
Oh, and we have the big presidential debate coming up on Thursday.
I know, man. Wow.
Get your popcorn.
Yeah, are you going to watch it?
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This one, you probably have to get tickets for this. This is going to be an interesting one. Yeah, I think the whole country, the whole world is just kind of holding their breath.
Well, I mean, it's being hosted by CNN.
I know.
They're going to stack the deck. And it's too... Biden, he'll have his earpiece in. And
it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting no matter what. So, yeah, they did have like some kind of rules of engagement. Are they going to be seated? Like they have to be seated or something. There's no studio audience, and they're going to shut their mic off when everything is done, which I'm not that opposed against that. Sometimes these guys get going on and on and on. I'm like, okay, I heard you. But, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, moving into this podcast, this was a hot week. We talked about your bike miles last week, and you had, what was it, like 560 or something? Or
I'm at 602 now.
Oh, and in this heat.
Yep.
You put on some serious miles.
I've been trying to ride outside more in the morning instead of the inside bike. So,
yeah.
And just putting on like 3 or 4 miles in each morning, and then I just did one kind of longer one.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I do the same. Like my workouts are all in the morning. And by the way, those of you who have been supporting the whole muscle and fitness competition thing that I got into, thank you from the bottom of my heart. We will find out this Thursday if I moved into the semifinals. I got into the quarterfinals last week, which was in the top 1% of all the people that got into this contest. I don't know how many there were, thousands, which at 63 is really cool. But it's made for a platform to be able to reach men. I mean, the reason that I'm doing it. And it's kind of cool. If I make it into the semis, it doesn't matter, but it's kind of cool, I guess, to be able to say to some of these younger guys, take care of yourselves. So that's going to be fun. Squirrel update.
Kevin is dead.
Aw. I started to laugh and I was like, aw.
Yeah. Well, so, yeah, they're on 196th Street in Westfield, right by my house. There was this enormous fat squirrel smashed by a car, and I thought, well, there you go.
Well, he probably had a little tombstone made that says, "Don't tread on me."
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
So
I was
no more.
I was picking up our youngest the other day from a friend's house, and as I pulled out, there wasn't a dead squirrel on the road before I got there, like 2 minutes. And I came out and there's a dead squirrel, and there's another one sitting there looking at it. I'm like, aw. I mean, animals, they do have relationship. A lot of people don't really understand that, but they do. They have relationship with each other. And, as being a hunter as I am, and many of you know that, sometimes it'll play on my head a little bit when I'm out there. And, I'm not one of these guys that's going out and saying, I'm going to shoot a bunch of does, or if there's like yearlings with the mom, I just kind of let them go by. I do have a heart, believe it or not, I do.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads into today's podcast, Braveheart.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, it's a little different. And don't play that music this week or you'll get me going again. Last week, if you listen to the podcast, he started playing this music I love from the wedding scene in the movie Braveheart. And I was playing it this morning when I got up because I was watching the second half for probably the 50th time. And that music was playing because Stacy was coming downstairs. It was probably at about 7 o'clock. She was leaving for work. And I wanted her to hear the music. I'm like, I want you to hear this. I was thinking of you. And it was one of these movie channels that will have ads sometimes.
Yeah.
And I was, trying to get her in this great mood before she leaves. I love you kind of a thing. And I hit the play button and it goes to some stupid ad. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. I had this whole thing set up. It happens. And I'll bet a lot of you guys know what that's like. You get something set up for your wife to want to move her heart. And then something happens and you're like, I tried. I did the first half of Braveheart last week, which is the ultimate guys movie. There's lots of guys movies, but from at least a lot of the guys that I know of, they're like, yeah, that's probably my number one or number two. It's my number one, bar none. So we're going to finish up where we started last week. And we ended last week where William Wallace, his bride, was tied to a stake. Oh, this is terrible. Kind of way you start off. And he's murdered by this corrupt English magistrate. Well, those of you that were listening last week or know the movie, Wallace fights his way, back to this magistrate to get revenge. And the men of the town finally see how their interaction, or lack thereof, has allowed this corruption to happen. And they finally step up and they get involved, in this battle, taking over these corrupt English soldiers. And this was kind of hard this morning. I was working on this episode, at the house up in my little studio, and I get this message from my wife Stacy, and she was letting me know that there was this guy who had come in where she worked. He's a much larger man. He was actually a former police officer, and this is nothing against police officers. I support the blue. I thank all of you who are out there, but every now and then, just like in anything, you can get someone who can be an issue, a problem. And it was a former police officer from years ago who had attempted to actually sexually molest my wife when she was a teen. And he had just walked into her office. And I'm watching Braveheart. I just got done watching this scene where they had murdered, Wallace's wife. And it was just hitting me. And she had shared this story with me back when we were dating. And I saw then, how much it had affected her. Well, today, she had come face to face with this slime ball. Sorry. Not sorry. She told me that when he saw her, she recognized her and gave her this really creepy smile. And instantly I wanted to rush out of the house to be there. But by the time I could arrive, he'd have been gone. And what's weird is I was in the middle. I was telling you, Eric, earlier, I was having these bad back spasms where I could hardly move. And that's exactly when it happened. But this incident, it's been over 20 years ago. It was more than almost closer to 25 probably. But I could still hear the pain through her words when she was messaging me today. This man tried to take what didn't belong to him, leaving her feeling powerless, leaving her feeling dirty and victimized. And, unfortunately, it became his word against hers when she reported it. And if I'm being really vulnerable and honest, I wanted to show up. I wanted to go full William Wallace on this guy when I found out that he was in there and kind of gave her this look. The man was a coward. He reminded me of that man that took William Wallace's bride's life. And that's what sexual abuse or assault does. It robs you at the deepest level. This situation, it hit me really hard today. Like I said, I had just seen that scene where Wallace's wife was taken from him. And in these moments, when we started this podcast today, I actually prayed. Right before we started, I said, I just want to get my head in a better place. But there is a time for a righteous anger. That's what drives us to make a difference in a world where the enemy has, like it says in John 10:10, the enemy has come to kill, steal, and destroy. Good men need to prevail. So, with that, let's go back to Braveheart and maybe discover some of these things in our lives that are worth fighting for, like our wives, like our children, like our families, like this country. So we stop the scene where William Wallace's wife's life had just been taken by that magistrate. He comes fighting his way back in. Well, now that's over with. And the next scene you see is he's burying his bride and he's kneeling down in front of her father to ask forgiveness. And if you remember that scene, it's a powerful scene. As you can imagine how both, Wallace and her parents are feeling. I mean, you can see it in their faces. You can see it in their tears. And as the father, Wallace gets down on his knees before the father to beg forgiveness. And it wasn't his fault. But the father, he's in one hand, he's wanting to strike Wallace, but with the other one, he reaches out and he puts his hand on his head as if to say, I know you're hurting too. But it creates a whole different narrative now. Because Wallace did not want to defend his country, all these different things. He just wanted to go back home and raise crops and family, which was great. But there came a time when tyranny was taking over the country and something different had to happen in order to be able to save this country that they love and that they needed to be fighting for. And, the story, it spreads quickly throughout Scotland what had happened. And the men from these other villages, they start to show up and band together against the English. That was the outcome, or what ended up driving these men. And it's a powerful thing when you see men join together for a common purpose, especially a righteous purpose, which in this case, as we know, is freedom. So back in England, you've got the king, and he's getting news about Wallace and this resistance that he's been pulling together. And in a meeting with his cabinet, his son, the future king, is present, and he's this kid's anything but wise and brave. And you know what I'm talking about if you've seen this. He's married to a strong woman, but this kid is never going to be able to rule as he doesn't have the courage and the strength within him. So, as the movie goes on, you're going to see his wife becoming the one that the king will eventually send out to be his liaison instead of his own son, which that has to be a really amazingly emasculating thing to this king's son, except being masculine probably wouldn't be a word you'd use to describe this king's son. I mean, this kid is weak. He's entitled. I'll just let it go at that. So battle after battle, Wallace and his countrymen, they're fighting through the English armies, and they're just going through them like butter. So, when men have a purpose, you'll see it in this movie, they are unstoppable. And those are the type of men that we're really needing to see today, especially in this generation. We need men who are going to be willing to stand up and fight for what they believe in. Well, meanwhile, you've got Robert the Bruce, who is heir to the Scottish throne. And he sits down with his father to discuss, what he should do next. This whole Scottish thing and the English thing are trying to figure out, do we fight back? Do we compromise? And in the meantime, he's seeing Wallace become this folk hero. And Robert the Bruce is becoming a huge fan of William Wallace, and he wants to be like him. Just how many of us have seen those who are willing to stand up for what is right, and they're willing to do whatever it takes? Because at our core, we all want to be someone like William Wallace. Robert the Bruce's father, in this one scene, tells him that the key to success, it's not fighting back, he says, but to give in to what the nobles want, or else Scotland is going to be no more. It's amazing the influence that a father has on his son. And Wallace's father, was different. He was a fighter. He would end up laying his life down for his country. But Robert the Bruce's father was a compromiser, and he'd end up selling his own soul, for land and titles. So as the news of this resistance is spreading across the land, more and more men, are now getting involved. Wallace is inspiring them to do something different, to fight for what they believe in. Well, back in England, you've got the king's daughter-in-law, I guess what you would call her, Isabella, and who's one day going to be the queen. She's like the princess now. And she is speaking with her assistant by the name of Nicolette. I think she was from France or something. But they're talking about William Wallace. And Isabella says, this Scottish rebel Wallace, she says, he fights to avenge a woman? Because she's heard the story about why he got involved. And Nicolette says a magistrate wished to capture him and found that he had a secret lover. So he slit the girl's throat to tempt Wallace to fight, and fight he did. Knowing his passion for his lost love, they next plotted to take him by desecrating the graves of his father and brother and setting an ambush at the grave of his love. She goes on to say, he fought his way through the trap and carried her body to a secret place. Now that's love, no? And you see Isabella lay her head back, against this pillar, almost longingly, and she says, love, I wouldn't know. Because remember, she's married to the king's son who doesn't even know who he is, and I'll just kind of leave it there. But something that's core to a woman is to have a man who is passionate about life. A man who's not a compromiser, a man who's not weak, a man who's not arrogant is something that women are looking for. She wants someone who's confident, that knows who he is, and that's willing to fight for her. I remember hearing a woman say, it's probably been 20 years ago now, that she liked, was it Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek? And she thought he was one of the most attractive men out there. And I was kind of puzzled at first, and I said, really? I said, he's just like this little bald, skinny guy. And she said, which I'm bald, by the way. And she said, yes, but he's extremely confident. She says, that is attractive. And I've said it many times, confidence isn't walking into a room thinking you're better than everyone else. It's walking into a room knowing that you don't have to compare yourself with anyone. Well, one of my favorite scenes, it's probably about a third of the way into this movie is where there's this man named Stephen who shows up at Wallace's camp, where he's with all these other Scottish, soldiers type things out in the forest. And this guy, Stephen, he is totally off his rocker. I mean, he's a madman, but he's committed to fight alongside Wallace and his men. And there's a scene where Wallace is he's stalking a deer with a bow. I like this guy. And just out of Wallace's line of sight, you see Stephen appear, and he's drawing his sword. Well, as Wallace is drawing back on the deer, he suddenly sees Stephen running towards him, unsheathing his sword. Wallace spins around, turns his bow on Stephen, but before he can fire the arrow, I mean, it's a split second, Stephen suddenly throws his sword in Wallace's direction, and it goes over Wallace's left shoulder and strikes a man in the chest who was stalking Wallace, and it kills him. As Wallace kneels down over the body of this guy, Stephen just kind of kneels down. He just killed this guy. And Stephen kneels down. He looks at Wallace, and he looks him in the eyes, and he says, "Are you sure the Almighty didn't send me here to watch your back?" He says, "I didn't like him anyway. He wasn't right in the head." I love this guy. It was like my son and I, we would always talk about this guy because my name's Stephen. But he's one of my favorite characters in this whole movie. We all need a Stephen in our life. When I was probably in about the 9th grade, I was being bullied by this one guy. And I don't know what the reason was for. He just didn't like me. He was way bigger than I was. And I had never done anything to this kid. He was way taller, a lot meaner. And one day, before the teacher got in the classroom, this tough kid, just kind of threw me up against the wall, and he was pressing his forearm and his wrist against my throat. And I was the skinny, quiet kid. But there was another kid who was pretty quiet, but he was tough as nails. And he wasn't that much bigger than me. He's just that one that you don't pick on. You've seen those guys are like 110-pound guy standing up to a 180-pound guy in high school because he just had that fight in him. But this quiet kid saw what was happening, comes flying in. He grabs this kid was like 6'4", grabs him, puts him up against the wall, and he says, "Don't you ever touch him again." This guy was my Stephen. Well, as the movie moves forward, these men are now coming down from the hills to help Wallace's army. But part of the problem is that Robert the Bruce won't commit his army to help Wallace. Even though he idolizes Wallace, but because of the influence that his father has over him, he just doesn't want to engage. And in one of the next scenes, they're about to go up against the English army, but they're scared because they don't have nearly the amount of, men, weapons, and horses. And as his army looks on, the English come marching up with all their weapons and might, and the men start to flee. And one of the nobles rides up and tells the men not to flee until they've negotiated. But, of course, you've seen the movie. If you haven't, it just stops no one from leaving. It's a cowardly way out. They're going to try to negotiate so they can leave. Well, as these men begin to leave, all of a sudden you see William Wallace come riding up on a war horse. He's got that blue war paint face paint on, and he's ready for battle. And he rides up to these men. And when they first see him, when he says, "My name was William Wallace," they don't believe it. Because, they imagine him being like 10 feet tall. That's what they had thought he must look like. And as the men are standing there holding like their rakes and their pitchforks, and they had a few swords, but Wallace gives one of the greatest speeches in any movie that I've ever seen. And he doesn't just ask them to stay and fight. He gives them two things. He gives them purpose and an identity. Listen to the words from this speech. He says, "Sons of Scotland, I am William Wallace." And this short little soldier goes, "William Wallace is 7 feet tall." Wallace says, "Yes, I've heard. Kills men by the hundreds. And if he were here, he'd consume the English with fireballs from his eyes and bolts of lightning from his arse." He says, "I am William Wallace, and I see before me an army of my countrymen here in defiance of tyranny." He says, "You have come to fight as free men, and free men you are. What would you do without freedom? Will you fight?" And another soldier speaks up, and he says, "Against that?" He says, "No, we will run and we will live." Wallace says, "Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live, at least for a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for just one chance to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?" Their response is just as if Jesus Christ himself rode up and said, I've got this. Now follow me. The men begin to cheer and they're raising their weapons in the air. And as Wallace rides off toward the English, two of his men ask him, he goes, where are you going? He says, I'm going to pick a fight. As you can imagine, that doesn't go real well. As both sides face each other for the battle, Wallace's army starts beating their shields, screaming and chanting, and then they turn their backs to the English, lift their kilts, and taunt the enemy. It's now game on. Well, William Wallace leads a whole army of his countrymen, who he has now given a purpose and a new name to victory. As a result, the Scottish nobles, they knight him, but they lack the courage to finish the battle that Wallace has been waging. And right after he's knighted, Wallace gets up with his men and they begin to leave and go up the stairs to leave. And a response comes that says, wait, Sir William, where are you going? Wallace says, we've beaten the English, but they'll come back because you won't stand together. Robert the Bruce tells Wallace that the nobles have so much to risk. We've got lands, we've got castles, we've got titles. And Wallace responds he goes, now tell me, what does that mean to be noble? Your title gives you claim to the throne of our country, but men don't follow titles. They follow courage. Now, our people know you, noble and common, they respect you. And then he says, if you would just lead them to freedom, they'd follow you, and so would I. Can you hear how he is encouraging and empowering the future king of this country to stand up and do something different? Stop compromising. Let your voice be heard, and let it be heard with actions. Well, in that moment, you can begin to see something change in Robert the Bruce's eyes. He wants to believe it, but he is so caught up in lands and titles that voice in the back of his head, his compromising father, that gets into his mind, which later you'll hear how he ends up betraying Wallace on the battlefield. When Longshanks, the King of England, he hears of Wallace's advancements, he decides to offer this truce so that his own head won't end up in a basket. And he says, I'll offer a truce and buying off Wallace and Robert the Bruce. He said, but who will go to him? Then Longshanks says, well, it won't be my gentle son. The mere sight of him would only encourage the enemy to take over the whole country. You see, weakness invites invasion and control, where what we do know to be true is peace comes through strength. We've seen it in our own country, and Wallace understands that. In the next battle, Wallace attempts to get Robert the Bruce to come alongside him, but Robert the Bruce is reluctant. It's because, unbeknownst to Wallace, he has a plan to betray Wallace to help bring what he thinks is going to be peace. And Wallace, seeing that Robert the Bruce is being tentative, he tells him, he says, there's a strength in you. I can see it. And that had to be difficult for Robert the Bruce to hear, knowing that he's about to betray, Wallace, the very one who has inspired him. In the very moment in the battle when Wallace needs Robert the Bruce's army to engage, they end up riding off, right when he needs, he and his men. And the Scottish army is now being destroyed. Wallace gets injured. And when Wallace sees a small group of English soldiers riding away on horses, one of the soldiers on horseback turns back towards Wallace, raises his lancer, charges Wallace, and knocks him off his horse, seriously injuring him. And Wallace, after being knocked down, he gets a hold of the man who just tried to kill him, pulls off his helmet, and it's Robert the Bruce. He had just been betrayed. And the look on both of their faces, it's an amazing story in itself. I mean, that one moment, I froze the frame and just looked at it. And you can see that what the look of betrayal is like and the one who betrayed. But knowing he's just been betrayed and the other, being a betrayer, it creates, Wallace's men see what's going on. They come running in. They rescue him before he can be killed. But they've all suffered greatly. And in the next scene, you see Wallace's boyhood friend, Hamish, and he's tending to his father, Campbell. You would have seen him earlier in the movie, father and son fighting side by side. But he's tending to his father's mortal wounds, and it's hard to watch. It could be one of the most powerful scenes in this entire movie. And Hamish's father, Campbell, he says to him, He says, son, I'm dying. Let me be. And Hamish, his son, says, no, you're going to live. And Campbell says these words, I've lived long enough to be free, proud to see you become the man you are. I'm a happy man. When my own father passed away back in 2014, he'd had a stroke. Dad could no longer communicate. He was gone 5 days later. And in those last moments, when I was with my dad until his final breath, I so wanted to be able to hear him speak to me. I sang to him during those long days and hours. I prayed over him. I told every story I could think of. But in the last moments, I so wanted to hear my dad say to me, I'm proud to see you become the man you are. I'm a happy man. That scene gets me every single time. I know that is how my father felt about me, but I want to be vulnerable and tell you that there were things in my life that I was ashamed of, that I wasn't proud of. The kind of stuff that I was afraid would cause my own dad not to be proud of me. But behind those still eyes of my father in those last days, I knew he was proud of me. And I will always carry that with me. I've made my mistakes, but here's what happened. I let those mistakes change me. I let those mistakes set the course for what I do today in reaching men. I would not trade what God did through my mistakes for anything, nothing in the world. I've heard so many men say the same thing. We begin to be transformed because God takes all those things and he changes us, like you're going to hear about Robert the Bruce. So when Robert the Bruce arrives back home, he's betrayed Wallace now. He goes to his father, who is riddled with leprosy. And he's been sharing how he's ashamed of himself for betraying Wallace and how he's lost heart. And his father tries to console him, and he says, well, all men betray, all lose heart. And Robert the Bruce looks at his father, who is decaying, and he says, I don't want to lose heart. I want to believe as he does. I will never be on the wrong side again. If you can remember from some of my earlier podcasts, I've talked about my story, how I'd lost heart, how I betrayed others when I was younger. And I would love to be able to say that I'm more like William Wallace. But in some ways, I think I'm probably more like Robert the Bruce. Wallace would eventually be taken prisoner at the hands of Robert the Bruce's arrangement with the Scottish nobles, and he'd be tortured to death while his brothers, look on. And they gave Wallace an option to have a quick death. And the only way they would do it is if he would just cry out for mercy and declare himself a loyal servant of the king. The king is up in this tower. He's dying, and he's just waiting to hear Wallace, cry out for mercy. And the crowd goes silent in this moment. They've been doing everything to torture Wallace, but he will not cry for mercy. He will not say those words. These people have seen enough pain and suffering, and they are so tired of all the ruthlessness and the bloodshed. And as Wallace is laid upon a table it's shaped like a cross, where he's finally going to be beheaded, the king and the crowd are just waiting to hear the word mercy come from his mouth. And as he lies there, he turns his head toward the crowd, and he sees this ghostly image appear. She passed on earlier, but he sees her image walking through the crowd, smiling at him. And there's this peace that comes over Wallace's face. Just when you think he's going to cry out for mercy, the executioner stops and says, the prisoner wishes to say a word. And with everyone listening and hoping for mercy, Wallace cries out the word. And we all know the ending. Freedom! As William Wallace is beheaded, you see his hand holding that cloth that had once held the flower that little girl who would later become his bride had held, and it falls to the ground. In the last scene of the movie, you see Robert the Bruce along with the Scottish army and the nobles. They're on the battlefield, and they're about to finally surrender to the English. And instead of riding across the battlefield to give in, Robert the Bruce turns to the men who fought alongside Wallace, the man who he had betrayed. And he pulls from his armor the cloth that William Wallace had given to his bride. It's the one he had carried with him in the battle, that fell from his hands only when he was beheaded. I will always see Robert the Bruce different because of the change you see in this moment. Robert the Bruce now lives up to the man Wallace had always seen in him. He turns to his men and he says, "You have bled with Wallace. Now bleed with me." And the next thing you see is Hamish drawing his claymore. He tosses it into the air. It lands sticking out of the ground with the entire army now charging the enemy. These men were given a new name, including Robert the Bruce. The very man who betrayed had now rebuilt trust and become their trusted leader. The movie ends with this. It says, "In the year of our Lord, 1314, patriots of Scotland, starving and outnumbered, charged the fields of Bannockburn, and they fought like warrior poets. They fought like Scotsmen, and they won their freedom." Remember how I talked about in a couple episodes ago that God gave me a new name years ago, and He says, "You are my warrior poet"? I once was Robert the Bruce, but I'm a changed man, transformed by the power and the grace of Jesus Christ. You can be too.